Okay, so my name is Claire. I'm the event coordinator for Village Books and Paper Dreams in Bellingham, Washington. And it is a great pleasure this evening to introduce our featured author. I would like to give a little context for tonight's event. While I am in Bellingham, Washington, up in the very northwest corner of the United States, 15 miles south of the Canadian border, Alec is in Baltimore. And we actually grew up together in Charleston, West Virginia. We didn't go to elementary school together, but we went to junior high and high school together. So let me just say a few words about my friend Alec. So Alec Ross is one of the world's leading experts on innovation, author of New York Times bestselling The Industries of the Future. He is currently a distinguished visiting professor at the University of Bologna Business School, and he previously served as senior advisor for innovation to the Secretary of State. He began his career as a sixth grade teacher in Baltimore. He's here tonight to discuss with me this brand new book right here, The Raging 2020s, Companies, Countries, People, and the Fight for Our Future. So a thunderous round of applause at home from wherever you may be watching. Please welcome Alec Ross. So Alec, this is
Thank
so
you,
wonderful
Claire.
to see you, and congratulations on your book.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I have to tell those who are listening in that when we were scheduling this, and I'm doing these virtual book events, but only with independent bookstores in the United States. And the woman who works for me said, "Yeah, the woman at this bookstore says she went to school with you. Do you recognize this name?" And I'm like, "Oh my goodness, of course." So I'm really pleased to see Bellingham, Washington, and Baltimore together by way of Charleston, West Virginia this evening. So thank you so much for having me, Claire, and thank you all for attending.
Yep. Well, it's certainly my pleasure. I have been looking forward to this event for weeks now. So okay, the Raging 2020s. Full disclosure, I was terribly intimidated to pick up this book and read it because being the 100% liberal arts brained person, I was afraid that it was going to be over my head, that I wasn't going to understand it. And I did not find that to be the case at all. It's just filled with information, very accessible information. And I really appreciated that about it. But what I was hoping that you would first start off with is telling us sort of the seed for this book. What was it that made you, when did you get the idea for it? What made you want to write specifically about this time?
Right. I decided I wanted to write about this time. In part, I'm like you in that I'm not an engineer by background. I'm not a mathematician by background. I'm a history major by background. And when I was thinking about the changes that were taking place in the United States and around the world, I thought back to other past moments in history. The 1920s, obviously, the title of this, The Raging 20s, sort of evokes the Roaring 20s. I thought about this period at the beginning of the 19th century when most of the Western world was transitioning from a dominantly agricultural-based economy into an industrial economy. And so it was really from a perspective of a student of history that I thought that we were actually entering into a really important moment of history, a transition moment. And if you don't mind me sort of geeking out for just a second on this,
Please.
This moment at the beginning of the 2020s reminds me of this period from 1800 to 1840 called the Engels Pause. And it was this period where, labor was going from farm to factory. And this was brought on by changes in technology. We are all living through lots of changes brought on by technology. And the changes at the beginning of the 19th century, which created this thing called industrialization, was wildly disruptive. But at the beginning of it, it was the industrialization of sort of the Charles Dickens novels, 11-year-olds getting hurt in factories. And for this period of 40 years, there were these really disorienting changes in the economy and in the world. And enormous amounts of wealth were created, but they were created for very small numbers of people. And the middle class and workers were no better off. And so what happened? It was the largest wave of revolutions in the history of the Western world. There were ideological movements like Marxism. The Communist Manifesto was written in 1848. And then ultimately, industrialization worked because we sort of rewrote our social contract. And as we innovated technologically, we also innovated in our public policy. We said, sure, you can work in that factory, but we're going to do something for the first time. It's called a child labor law. You can't actually work in the factory until you're 16 years old. Yes, you can work in that factory, but we're going to create this new thing called a minimum wage. The concept of a weekend. Weekends didn't really exist until the 19th century. It was really a product of unions that said, you know what, instead of just Sunday, the day of our Lord, what about giving workers the day off before? So there were just thing after thing after thing after thing that made industrialization work. And as I was thinking about the change in our economy from being an industrial economy to the economy that we're moving into now, which is technology rich and knowledge based, I thought, my God, we're in another one of these transitions where we need to sort of rewrite our social contract. And that then began a period of investigation and research that led to this book, sort of deep diving and trying to understand the past a little bit better in order to be able to write about the near-term future.
Could you explain for folks what exactly the social contract is?
Sure. The social contract is this sort of unwritten thing that defines the relationship between people, government, and business. And in certain respects, you know, a social contract of some sort has existed ever since humankind has been on 2 feet. You know, ever since humans figured out that they could withstand the elements and saber-toothed tigers better if they banded together instead of trying to make it entirely on their own. There's been a sort of set of assumptions baked into an informal and formal set of relationships and rules that sort of govern our behavior. They say, yeah, we can band together, but you don't get to steal from each other. You don't get to kill each other. You don't get to rape and pillage. And so it's something that's evolved over centuries. It's something that needs to constantly be revised, but at sometimes more dramatically than others. So that's what I mean when I say the social contract.
Yeah. And what do you see happening to the social contract today? I know you mentioned in your book that that the planet itself needs to be added to that
Yes.
Piece.
Yes. So I think the social contract has essentially stopped working for too many people in the last 30 years. And first of all, as you mentioned, Claire, we are now feeling the force and effect of what I think of as sort of the original sin of industrialization. The original sin of industrialization was the destruction of our climate and environment. And so I don't feel like we can continue living and working the way that we have been without making our planet, our climate and environment sort of a signatory or at least a stakeholder in our social contract. And then the other thing that I think has sort of really sort of torn at the fabric of the social contract is globalization and sort of our failure to sort of keep up with our social contract as the world has changed dramatically over 30 years. And look, I'm a capitalist. You know, a part of what I do in addition to writing books is I'm a partner in a venture capital fund. I believe in entrepreneurship and innovation, but I also, you know, recognize that among the world's wealthiest people and wealthiest companies, it's sort of heads I win, tails you lose, and that our capitalism really isn't working very well right now. You know, it's the case that a single FedEx driver right now, more often than not, in most years of the past 5 years, will pay more in federal taxes than Federal Express Corporation. You know, the 17-year-old barista at a Starbucks pays more in federal taxes than Starbucks, and pays more in and the independent coffee store will pay more in federal taxes than Starbucks. So globalization has basically created a set of circumstances where we need to radically reorient our public policies and rewrite our social contract. And I say that as somebody who believes that globalization has been an overwhelming good. If you sort of think about all the 8 billion people on planet Earth in all 196 countries, I think it's been overwhelmingly positive. But what it has done is for huge swaths of the United States, it's led to stagnation and decline. And we need to repair our capitalism so that it works for more and more people, instead of creating this sort of almost Mad Max-like state of inequality that we're entering into right now.
Well, you talk so much about how corporations now have such key roles in our lives that we've done, that is unprecedented, really. Before I ask you my next question, I just want to let you know that the mic on your on your headphones is rubbing against the zipper. There we go.
I'll take this off.
Cool.
There we go.
There was just causing, whenever it would hit the zipper, it was just creating a little staticky sound, but
sorry about that.
Oh no, it's okay. So and thinking about how corporations, whether we want them to or not, how they are inserting themselves in our lives, I'm wondering if that's why you opened the book up with the story about talking about insulin and the situation with people who need to get insulin because they are diabetic, and what has happened over the last decade with the cost of insulin, and how people are now they don't have, and there are three corporations who, or pharmaceutical companies, I guess, who make it. And so people don't have any choices because the prices are set by them, and this is what you have to pay. And so could you talk about why you started out your book with that example, that story of the stories of the people who need to get insulin and can't get it at reasonable or affordable prices?
Sure. So I think that if you just sort of make the blank statement that corporations are getting more and more powerful, and corporate power is getting increasingly concentrated, most people would say, yeah, I get it. Okay, yeah, sort of sucks, but it doesn't, is it really that big a deal? And the reason why I wrote about concentration in the pharmaceutical industry and told some of the stories that I did was to illustrate that it actually produces a body count. People actually die when we take the cost of something like insulin, which is a prerequisite for living for many people. And when the price of that goes up 1,200% over the course of 10 years, and where insurance coverage continually goes down, I wanted to write about the real world consequences. And some of the stories that I tell in the book are about young people, one of whom was, recently, because of his age, had to transition out of his parents' health insurance, how they are hoarding their insulin. And it was interesting, during some of the riots on the East Coast 2 years ago, with some of the Black Lives Matter protests that were taking place, when some of the drugstores would get broken into, interestingly, the one thing that got targeted to be stolen out of there was insulin. And so I told the story about insulin in this case, basically to demonstrate that, yeah, this actually kills people. And the larger point in this was that in many respects, I think we're more governed by companies than we are by our government. And that these big companies, over the last handful of years, I ran tech and media policy for Obama's first presidential campaign and got to know a lot of the sort of masters of the universe in this technology world in particular, and then have spent a lot of time with them, over the last 10 years, for both good and bad. And, part of what I see is that Amazon is a country, Facebook is a country, Google is a country, Apple is a country, and their CEOs are more powerful than presidents and prime ministers. And the tricky thing about this, Claire, is Sure, most of them they're all intelligent, but they are operating in a sort of totalitarian environment. I mean, there is no democratic consent that determines how they exercise power. There is no democratic consent that largely restrains their ability to do things. And so I think we're beginning to recognize the consequences of that. There's been a lot of things about Facebook in the news over the last several weeks in particular, but it's just, that is one of 50 examples. And, the insulin example is another. And my point in all of this is that we're more governed by companies than we are by countries. And as we rewrite our social contract, part of what we have to do is make sure that we maximize the promise and minimize the peril of all of this corporate power.
Well, so let's talk a little bit about the government
Mm-hmm.
and how ineffective it's becoming in making change. Or there's a quote in your book that I really felt like hit the nail on the head. You said, we're in a moment of stagnation and inflection, mired in polarization, cludgeocracy, weakened institutions, brain drain, and captive of government by industry. First of all, could you just really quickly say what cludgeocracy is? I had never
Sure.
heard that word before, and I love it.
Okay, so Cludge. So for a software program, a Cludge is like a software patch. It's like if there's a piece of crappy computer code that isn't working, it's sort of like putting duct tape on it. It's sort of like putting digital duct tape on it. And in the context of government, what it means is that instead of making things simple, we make things incredibly complicated. We just add layers of complexity to things. So if you think about it, Claire, 100 years ago, we built bridges. We built subway systems. 70 years ago, we built a massive national highway system. Today, we can't add a lane to a highway without it taking years and billions of dollars. So and one of the reasons for this, I argue, is just the complexity of getting anything done in government. Things that it seemed like we could do 100 years ago, with less technology and fewer resources, we were able to do far more effectively for some reason than we are today. So that's what cludgeocracy is.
And it seems like corporations, as their own countries, they are able to maneuver in such a way that they can do essentially what they want and get their agendas done. Whereas with, as you also say, representation democracy is inefficient by design. So our democracy has become so totally polarized and like this. Do you see a way that things can get done, when any progress can be made, if two opposing sides simply will not any longer agree with each other or try to work together?
Yeah. So look, I'm a relentless optimist. So I do
Okay.
think
I try to be too. I'm relying on you.
Yeah, no, look, only optimists change the world. So I am an optimist. So I do believe we can get through this. But let me first say what I think one of the dangers are. So when you get to these difficult moments of inflection, what people oftentimes want is the sort of strong man to come in and just make things happen. So this happened in the 1840s when the revolutions started in Europe. A series of authoritarians came in. This happened after the roaring 1920s with the economic collapse. Italy, democratically elected Benito Mussolini, a fascist. Adolf Hitler was democratically elected. Germany tilted towards Nazism. The United States picked a different route when it tilted toward FDR and the New Deal. But there is this inclination toward picking these sort of strong men leaders, and they become popular. If you look, let's take the United States out of it for a second. Putin in Russia, Erdogan in Turkey, Duterte in the Philippines, Bolsonaro in Brazil. We're sort of in a moment of the rise of the authoritarians. And that's because of the perception that they can get things done. So that's the danger. Do I believe that we can get out of this hyperpolarization that we're in right now? I don't think we're ever going to be able to go back to the kind of governing, I won't say ever. I think it will be difficult for us to go back to the kind of governing consensus that we had over a lot of issues sort of through the Cold War. Sure, there were lots of things that were fiercely debated, but there were also a lot of things that created consensus. But right now, if you had a resolution in the United States Senate that just said, be it resolved, the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, it would be a 50-50 vote. Unfortunately. So
Yes.
in this case, what I believe the only thing that can help bring us through is good old-fashioned leadership. This is not something that we can there's not going to be software that gets us through this. This isn't something that we can outsource to our algorithms. And so what I do think, like going back to our native West Virginia, Claire, I now live in a very different place in Baltimore, and the politics in Baltimore are the near opposite of the politics in West Virginia, even though the economic circumstances are very similar. And so what I imagine, what I hope for is the emergence of the kinds of leaders who can sort of bring together the interests of Baltimore and West Virginia, which right now are wildly divided. Wildly divided as much because of cultural issues as policy issues.
Yeah.
But to your question, the only thing that's ever pulled through things like this are social movements, political movements, intellectual movements, largely led by people.
Well, I continue to have hope, but it's hard. It's hard to remain optimistic watching the news and listening to the news. So speaking of where we came from, I want to, of course, acknowledge that this is the 100th year anniversary of the largest union labor uprising in American history, the Battle of Blair Mountain in West Virginia. Yes. So I was hoping we could talk about unions and how just a little bit about how they have changed, how they have been perceived, and what they're like now, and are they something that even work today?
Yeah, so unions are, the role of workers and the role of labor is one of the things that I write about in some detail in this book. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons why I argue that we are in need of sort of rewriting our social contract is because I believe we need sort of a labor movement oriented toward the future. The most interesting interviews, the one interview or the one person who sticks out the most of the more than 100 interviews I did for this book, somebody who died about a month before its publication, Richard Trumka, who was the president. Right. Yeah. He was the president of the AFL-CIO, and before that, he was the president of the United Mine Workers. He's from a coal mining family in Western Pennsylvania. And I wanted to understand why, from my perception, unions had grown so weak. And if you think about, the heyday of unionization and union power, and I write a little bit about this from like the 1930s through the 1960s, this was a period where the wealth and well-being of American workers really shot up. I mean, right. There was a boom in the American middle class. And then we saw a decline in union power. And there are a variety of different reasons for that. But ultimately, and this is where I had some spirited debates with Trumka about this. I do believe that the union movement in the United States is substantially culpable for a lot of its own troubles. Unfortunately, it's been largely defensive. It has tried to sort of maintain some of what it's had in the past. as opposed to looking at where job growth is going to be and trying to position workers for the areas of job growth in the future. It's also being caught up bluntly with a lot of corruption. Two successive presidents of the United Auto Workers were just arrested. And so, long story short, the union movement in the United States has had a really bad 40 years. And simultaneous to this, we moved from what's called the stakeholder model of capitalism to the shareholder capital of capitalism, which is a long way of saying moving from a form of capitalism where where if you earn $1, that dollar is supposed to be shared between the shareholders, workers, and the surrounding community, to a form of capitalism where you're really trying to maximize the return to the shareholders 100% of the time. And when that happened, that also substantially weakened unions, because in areas of the United States with strong unions, think about Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, the manufacturing center from that part of America moved south, which had many more anti-union laws in place, along with big tax breaks. And so it's been a pretty rough 30 or 40 years. But what was interesting is at the very end of his life, I thought Richard Trumka had some remarkable insights about the future of labor. And part of what I tried to write about is that the state of unions in the United States is actually fair. It's not unique, but it's an outlier. And I try to point to examples for how workers and labor are working much more effectively in other parts of the world. I sit, for example, on the board of directors of a Swiss company, and in Switzerland, there's a much stronger union system rooted in this concept called co-determination, where basically workers have a stake in the governance of the company. And I write a lot about models in Northern and Central Europe to try, hopefully, to give some examples for how unions can work with companies in a capitalist environment in a future-oriented way that creates a win-win scenario, as opposed to the model in the United States that I think is mostly broken right now.
I'm curious to know what your thoughts were as you followed the attempt to unionize the Amazon workers in Bessemer, Alabama.
Yeah,
that was fascinating to me to watch, and I thought it was quite a long shot. But I'm curious to know what your observations were, or thoughts were on that.
So my thoughts were, I guess I have nuanced views of it. So I believe that workers inside organizations like Amazon need to have collective rights. They need to be able to have collective bargaining. They need to be able to represent themselves to the shareholders and the executives in a strong way. The problem is that a lot of the unions that were trying to push the unionization efforts were the old broken down, busted unions.
Oh.
And so that's the sad thing. Like, I think in the same way in which we have startups, and the same way in which we innovate in business, and part of what I try to write about a little bit in the Raging 2020s are some promising startups, but they're very small in the union world. So I don't think that we can just take the old broken down unions and bring them inside some of the organizations like Amazon, and they ultimately work well. And I think that's part of why the employees rejected it. But I do think that there were some interesting unadvertised benefits to the effort. So, for example, Amazon and Walmart both just announced within the last month and a half that they will pay the college tuition for their hourly workers, which I don't think they're not doing that out of the goodness of their hearts. They're doing it because I think they recognize that workers are at an inflection point right now where they're demanding more, where they want more. And if you're an Amazon or you're a Walmart, you want the kind of employee who, with her or his free time, they're taking college classes, they're going to college. But a side problem of this, Claire, goes back to an earlier part of our conversation where I said where we are more governed by companies than we are by countries, than we are by governments. This is an example of Walmart and Amazon addressing the student loan crisis.
Right. Right.
In part because government isn't. So,
Right.
so who's dealing with the student loan issue inside these communities? It's not government, it's Walmart and Amazon. And that when I talk about rewriting the social contract, part of what I'm saying is we've sort of lost the equilibrium. Things are upside down when suddenly Amazon and Walmart are addressing the student loan crisis more forcefully than the government.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That I hadn't actually even thought about it that way. But yeah, if you're having to get your college education funded by Amazon or Walmart, what does that say about our systems in place?
and these are and look, we haven't raised the federal minimum wage since 2008.
I cannot
13 years.
believe. I
13
honestly,
years.
I didn't even know when I saw in the book how low the federal, I didn't know how low it was. And then I, looked it up. I mean, because, I wanted to verify that you knew what you were talking about, Alex.
Yeah, good. I want to be, I need to be fact checked.
And I couldn't believe it. I mean, $7.25.
But this goes back to the same point, Claire. So this means that the government doesn't really set the minimum wage. It means that Walmart sets the minimum wage. It means that Amazon sets the minimum wage. And I thought it was really interesting, a story I tell in the story, a story I tell in the book. The CEO of Walmart actually called for the minimum wage to be increased, because then instead of this race to the bottom that Walmart has with its competitors, if the federal government will raise the minimum wage, then they all have to raise their minimum wage.
Right.
And so the world is upside down when this CEO of Walmart goes to Congress and tells Congress to raise the minimum wage, and they still don't. That is a world that is a little upside down.
Can you speak real quickly about, because I'm really curious to know about, do you think that it will be possible for gig workers to unionize, to have any kind of any kind of rights?
Yes. So they have to, because an increasing percentage of workers are gig or contract workers. The days of having an employer, a single employer for 30 years with fully vested benefits, and at the end of those 30 years you get a pension. I won't say those days are over, but they're depreciated. It's not like it used to be. And for an increasing percentage of workers, it's project by project, it's gig by gig, it's Uber drive by Uber drive. And so when I talk about a 21st century labor movement, this is exactly what I'm talking about. But there's some unique challenges. If you think about sort of the caricature of union organizing, it's based on the sort of proverbial factory floor. It's people who know each other, who oftentimes have fairly intense or long-standing relationships. But in a world where, if you're an Uber driver, for example, you don't actually, there's no Uber factory floor. Your entire relationship is curated by this. And you don't necessarily know other drivers. So when I think about the opportunity to unionize or build a labor movement for gig workers, it has to take advantage of the same kinds of, it has to be organized through the same kinds of digital platforms that are curating their work. But I also think it's the case that this is again a place where government needs to step in. We do need to define rights for gig and contract workers in the same way in which we have defined rights for employees as traditionally defined. Because if you're a company and you're trying to maximize shareholder value, you now have an incentive to have ever more gig workers, ever more contract workers, and very few good old-fashioned full-time employees getting employee benefits.
What do you make of the hiring crisis that's happening right now? It's a little bit of a deviation from what we're talking about, but I mean, we're experiencing it. Everybody I know who's in any kind of business or in across all industries, everything. What do you make of the hiring crisis that we face right now?
So it goes right to the title of the book, The Raging 2020s. I think people coming out of the pandemic, in the pandemic, after 18 months of this, preceded by a decade of paycheck by paycheck stagnation, I think that there's a lot of introspection that's taking place right now. In some cases, I think that cash payments, people being able to make 80%, living at, being at home, are not going to just make 20% more going back at work. But I think that there's something much more substantial to this. And people who are resigning from jobs who are not getting those cash payments, I think demonstrate that. I think we're at a moment where workers are beginning to demand, even if they can't always articulate how or why. And that's part of why I wrote this book, was to try to give a little bit of the explanation for the how and why behind all of this. They want a new deal. They want a new relationship. And this has happened a couple times in the past. During the agricultural age, for centuries, there was a 6-day work week. And the work day was the number of hours of sunlight. So the number of the work day was anywhere from 9 to 14 hours a day, and it was Monday through Saturday. Then with industrialization, the norm became 5 days a week and 40 hours, 5 days a week and 40 hours a week. I think we're at a point now where people want, I won't say it's 4 days a week, but they want a more flexible work arrangement. We're all working at home now. So it's not like it was, Claire, when you and I got our first jobs out of college, or even 10 years after our first jobs out of college, where you left work. Like if you left work at 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. or 7 p.m., you were not at work until you showed up the next morning. But now, because we're all connected by these, because we're all connected through email and text messaging, we're never actually off work.
No,
we're not.
Nope.
And so I think we're all feeling that. And I think parents in particular are feeling it all the more acutely, because you're managing households, you're managing kids' lives along with your personal life, along with your professional life. So I think we're at a breaking point. And I think the hiring crisis is an existential crisis. And I think it's perfectly logical. And we are making, Claire, huge amounts of money. The Dow is, depending on it's at new highs. The amount of wealth we're creating in the United States these are boom ties. So I think what workers want is a more equitable distribution of that wealth. And let me just throw out a number or two. So I'm much younger than you, Claire.
I'm sorry, 1 month?
I'm a month younger
than
than
a
you.
half?
I'm joking. Yeah. All right. So I was gonna say I think I'm young. I'm 49.
It's coming. 50's coming for you too, Alec.
50's,
it's right around the corner.
Claire just had her birthday and mine is next month. So Claire, when we were in third grade, all right, when we were in third grade, if over the course of those 40 years, if the level of inequality had just remained the same from the time that we were in third grade to today, it would mean that 50 trillion with a T, $50 trillion would go to every worker earning 90% or below, and at the 90th percentile or below. That is it's just math. This is $1,100 per worker per month. Now imagine all of the workers in America getting $1,100 per month additional. Like, people would be a lot happier, right? It would solve a lot of problems. But this is the Mad Max like state of our inequality. I'll give you one more little piece of math. If we're to go back to our sophomore year of college, all right, where we are 19 years old. Since you and I were 19 years old, Claire, the wealthiest 1% in the United States has grown $21 trillion richer, while the lower 50%, all right, top 1%, $21 trillion richer. Bottom 50% has grown $900 billion poorer, and the middle class has stagnated.
Wow.
And so this is a big deal. And now I've been living and working with a lot of the people in that 1%, and I don't hate them. I'm not saying they're bad people. I'm not saying we need to crucify them, but it is bananas. I mean, it is bananas that I mean, just the math of this is insane. And so the resignations that are taking place right now, I don't think most people could spit out those numbers like I just did, but this is something that's been festering for decades now. And you add a pandemic to that, and you've got an existential crisis among American workers. And this is not happening in countries. This is not happening in countries which have not had this dynamic. This isn't happening in Germany. It's not happening in Italy. It's not happening in Switzerland. It's not happening in other countries that are capitalist and Western and bear a lot of similarities to our own, but which don't have this wild Mad Max-like state of inequality. It's not happening there.
So how to level it? How to?
Yeah. So look,
so my question is, I feel like are we too? Is the United States too big? Are we too entrenched in the way things are? This is the way it feels, to a regular civilian, to me. Are we just so mired in the way things are and the way things have been going? Like, it's just really hard to imagine a deviation.
We've done it in the past, and I think we'll do it again. I mean, we've done it in the past. Like, we had this is what happened over a decade after World War I, and we ended up in a total ditch. And Franklin Roosevelt proposed this, what seemed like completely audacious vision for basically rewiring the entire economy of the United States. And we succeeded in so doing. I don't think we're going to have a New Deal at an FDR-like scale, but I do think, and part of what I tried to do in this book is write about. It wasn't like the voice of God. This is what Alec Ross thinks that we should do to fix all these problems. But what I did try to do were bring in stories and some very hopeful examples of how other states and societies are navigating these changes. When I write about the Nordic countries, my point with the Nordic countries, these are wildly capitalist countries. They have more billionaires per capita than the United States does in many cases, but part of what they also have is a very strong safety net. And it's very collective as opposed to individualized as it is in the United States. So ultimately, I am optimistic. The Raging 2020s is actually a hopeful book, but we have to understand why we're angry. We have to, when we say the system isn't working for us, the government isn't working for us, unions aren't performing like they used to, we have to unpack why that is so that we can get to constructive solutions.
And I think that there's a lot is written in your book about China, which is all fascinating. and very much a cautionary tale. There's a quote, you do say a real world 1984 situation happening with China. It reminded me of, do you remember the movie with Tom Cruise called Minority Report?
Yes.
A lot of what you were writing about in China was making me think about that movie, and it was making me very uncomfortable.
It should be, because that's one of the models. I mean, if you want to get all of this under control, you can take, the Chinese are increasingly influential. Like China is under control right now. And a lot of the developing world is actually taking fairly substantial inspiration from China right now. They see the United States as being very messy. So the United States was always, it was the shining house on the hill, for decades through the Cold War. But I think we've lost a lot of our global standing in recent years because we do look so messy. And countries take inspiration from China. One thing I hope I don't know if it's obvious or not, Claire, but one point I do want to make in this is that for me, this isn't about left or this isn't about the political left or political right. It's not about left or right. It's about forward. And in fact, there are a couple words that are banned from the book. I don't know if you noticed, but the word Trump, Obama, Clinton, Biden, those words literally don't appear in the text.
I noticed, and I was very pleased because I thought this is a book that anyone can read. They can read it, they can take in the information. They're not going to see any of those words and have an immediate knee-jerk reaction of, oh, that's, that's where he's coming from. Oh, that's where he's trying to go. That's the message that he's trying. I really appreciated very much that those words did not appear in the book.
Well, thank you.
I noticed it.
Yeah. I do think that smart people can become stupid as soon as they hear those words. It makes us intellectually lazy. And I'll be honest with you, I'm guilty of it too.
Oh, sure. Me too. Yes. Yep.
I mean,
absolutely.
I will get as triggered as quickly as anybody else. But it's interesting, like I find you can have an elevated discussion about these issues up to the point where you invoke political partisanship or those names. So part of what I try to do with this as well is try to lay out these issues without making it about the political protagonists in Washington right now, but really looking at what's happening in Washington and who is running one thing or another as byproducts of a larger set of systems and powers.
Well, I think that you did that really, really well. And I learned so much from reading it. I want to remind everybody who's watching, if you do have a question for Alec, please feel free to put it in the Q&A or put it in the chat. So things that I was surprised about, I didn't know that you worked on a beer truck delivering beer after high school.
I did.
I did not know that your great-grandfather was a coal miner.
He was not a coal miner. He worked in the coal camps. He worked in
coal camps. Okay.
He worked in the mines, but he was not in there pulling coal out of the mountain.
But
yeah.
Nevertheless, he worked with the miners.
Yeah, and my great-grandfather did die of black lung from the coal camps. Yes. Brutal.
Wow. Well, Cheryl in the audience has asked, actually, I think that we discussed this with the gig workers. Can you address the hidden technology workers, i.e. contract IT?
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot of what we were talking, I was talking about before, which is the whole idea of contract work being almost the default now, as opposed to this exception, has really negative effects. And so you get these people who are in this sort of no man's land in terms of employment protections when they're contract workers. And in fact, if you go to a lot of big companies right now, the badges that people wear will identify whether they're an employee or a contractor. And people sometimes can work at a company for 5, 6, 7, 8 years and never actually be an employee of the company. This is increasingly common, where contractors, well, there are people, this happened at the State Department, when I was working at the State Department, there were people who would work at the State Department for going on 10 years. They showed up for work 5 days a week, 40 hours a week at the State Department. They did work only for the State Department, but they were not State Department employees. And they therefore didn't get any of the benefits that came from federal employment. And so this is an example of, again, an aspect of our capitalism that needs to be repaired, because all of these folks are working in sort of this gray area where they're employed, but they aren't protected.
Right. Right. Well, I would like to say that when I finished reading the book, I did feel optimistic. Even
Good.
though I still had all these questions for you about, but can we really work our way out of this? And I want to let people know that it is definitely, all of the information is very accessible. It's not heavy-handed. I found it to be a very compelling read. I read it really fast, which was surprising to me. I thought, okay, this is I need to do this slow, but no, I mean, it was great. So well done. Well done, you.
Thank you.
And I want to say thank you so much for being here tonight. Oh, it looks like we might have, Cheryl says thank you. I thought that was another question. I'm going to put in the chat here real quick the link to our website so folks can purchase copies of the book. And just as kind of a last little silly thing that I did not warn you that I was going to do, because I want people to see that, see Alex and me in the context of the last time we saw each other. I don't think you went to the 20th high school reunion, did you?
I was not there. I was in India, I think.
Okay.
I was in some bizarre part of the world. Yes.
So the last time that we saw each other, that we were actually together, was senior year of high school.
Yep. Which
was 1990. So I thought that it was important that people see.
Oh my God. Oh, that's fantastic.
Look how cute we were, Alec.
That makes me very happy. Oh my goodness, Claire.
Weren't we adorable?
We were babies.
I know. There we are.
And now I have children that age.
Yep. And so, I mean, then also.
We're still going strong though.
I know. And I have a couple more pictures just because I could. So speaking of unions, I have a really great picture of our two of my favorite teachers striking. There's Mary Sullivan and Mrs. McGurin. Mary Sullivan was my favorite teacher, French teacher. Mrs. McGurin was, she was world history, right?
Yes.
So there they are striking, which I think is great. I think they're in front of Overbrook Elementary School.
That makes sense. Oh my
and then
God.
I just needed to show everybody that you could rock a turtleneck.
Oh boy.
And for some reason, the yearbook people decided that this needed to be in there.
Oh my gosh. I think I might be wearing another turtleneck too. Like who wears a white turtleneck? Like,
right. And let's have a picture of Alec Ross eating a salad, like stuffing it while he's stuffing it in his mouth.
So the shocking thing about that is that looks exactly like my oldest son eating, who's now 19, who I need this book to sell lots of copies for no other reason than feeding him is like it's like owning a herd of horses. Oh my gosh.
Funny. Okay, there's this last one, and I like this last one because it kind of gives us an idea of things to come for young Alec. There you are. Look at you at the computer.
Oh my goodness.
Doing what you do.
Being a nerd. I think that is, you know what that is? I remember that. That was one of those one of those super geeky clubs that I was a member of. And we were all sitting around, and this is I think this is what one of those competitions where where questions are coming up and
Uh-huh.
we're competing with other schools. It's like, and so that's David Foster to my right,
Uh-huh.
who was really good at math, and he was a lot better at math than I was. So he clearly was right beside me in
Mhm.
case there were any math questions. So I was there for like the literature and the history, but it's really important that David Foster was right beside me in case there were math questions. That is hilarious.
Well, and I think it was called the Knowledge Board.
Oof, that sounds right. You know,
I and for our audience members, you should all know that Claire was not on the Knowledge Board.
stop.
So anyway, okay, well, you know, I I am just so pleased that you were able to join me tonight.
Well,
And
thank you,
this has
Claire.
been fun. This has been
Thank
so
you.
much fun.
And if I could just say to the one last thing to the
Yeah,
audience,
please.
I only do this with independent bookstores. So I'm thrilled if you do choose to get a copy of my book, The Raging 2020s. What I would ask is that if you do, buy it from Village Books. Go online to their website. It's really important in a world where, you know, companies like Amazon are as big and powerful as countries. Village Books in Bellingham is competing against a $1 trillion organization.
It's true.
And so we have to make choices, like the choices of who we buy our books from, who we buy our coffee from. It actually really matters. And so I just, in addition to thanking you, Claire, I just want to ask the audience to, you know, whether it's my book or another, or my book and another,
Mhm.
to please go to the Village Books website, because those choices are the kinds of things that make our capitalism work.
Yes, thank you very much. And I do happen to know that Taylor Books on Capitol Street in Charleston has copies because that's where my mom got hers.
That makes me
So,
happy.
yep. So thank you all. Thank you to everybody who tuned in this evening. And Alec, this was a pleasure. I hope I get to see you again soon one day. In person would be great.
Yes,
But
please. That would be
yeah.
great.
All right. I think with that, we'll say good night. So good night, everybody.
Thank you all.